Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's got to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and, well, for the next hour, they're going to read the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
Thanks, Dr. Stan. Good to be with you again.
Boy, we are certainly living in exciting times, aren't we?
Yes, it's like a steamroller. And
I've never seen anything like it. I know you've been at it for a long time. I have, too. And there's just so many things happening, so many places in the world. But, of course, what's happening to our economy is unbelievable. What's happening in the Near East is unbelievable. What's happening in Japan is just a disaster. But I think that there is a growing awareness across America. You pick up the story and tell us the featured articles this week in World Affairs Brief.
Well, the main article is the U.S. is setting the stage for inserting troops into Libya. The U.S. is falsely claiming that it's taken a backseat role to NATO in the offensive operations of the attack on Libya. But even the normally pro-government New York Times revealed that Pentagon officials disclosed Wednesday that American warplanes had continued to strike targets in Libya even after the Obama administration said the United States was, quote, stepping back from offensive missions and letting NATO take the lead. But there's even more deception and provocation to come in order to justify the intervention of U.S. and NATO troops in Libya. After all, there has to be a reason, some reason, for the Marine 2nd Division to be already in transit to the Mediterranean. And that instigation or provocation is going to be the beating of drums for humanitarian crisis in the besieged city of Misrata. Rebel leaders are there claiming that a massacre is going on because a mere some 23 civilian casualties have occurred because of an artillery barrage. Well, the U.S. regularly kills that many civilians in Afghanistan almost every day during airstrikes and offensive operations, and yet they will claim this level of casualties justifies more intervention on the ground. Army General Carter Ham of the Africa Command told CBS News that while ground forces wouldn't be ideal, they may be a possible way to aid rebels. Well, you have to remember in Obama's speech about it, he says absolutely no troops into Libya, and we know darn well that they're going to put them in there. General Ham admitted that the current operation largely stalemated, and that is why the U.S. must conjure up a humanitarian crisis. And as Reuters pointed out, Libyan rebels begged for more NATO airstrikes on Thursday, saying they face a massacre from government artillery barrages in Misrata. But meanwhile, the Western allies are squabbling over the campaign. Rebels set a hail of Grad rockets fired by besieging forces into a residential district of Misrata. Libya's third largest city had killed 23 civilians, mostly women and children. Aid organizations warn of, there's that word again, humanitarian disaster in Misrata, the lone rebel bastion in western Libya, where hundreds of civilians are said to have died in a 6-week siege. Well, how do we know? Reports of casualties have no independent verification, Stan, because there are no journalists on the ground. So how do we know that the rebels aren't just making this up in order to justify, or how do we know that they aren't even being provoked to make it up, make it appeal? Now, I'm sure there are some civilian casualties. But clearly, this is a double standard for the U.S. to say ho-hum about their civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and yet make this a justification for a wider war.
But of course, the American people are always a sucker for the idea of, humanitarian. We need humanitarian aid to all these communist dictators throughout the world. We have to be concerned about the civilians. We have to be concerned about the children. And there'll be pictures, I'm sure, of weeping mothers and crippled children and children with bandages all over them. They'll play on the emotions of the American people. When are they going to understand it's all a wag the dog situation? They create our reality through the media. When are people going to wake up to the fact we're being manipulated into another war? Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. Our guest this afternoon is Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, and as you know, Joel writes a regular weekly newsletter, and this week he's talking about the fact that everything points to the fact that the United States is going to commit troops to Libya. Now, of course, the President has said that this is not going to happen, but when did President Obama ever tell the truth? Remember, he's going to close down Guantanamo. Remember, he's going to bring our troops home from Iraq and from Afghanistan. Remember, we were going to have a transparent government. And, of course, now he tells us there's not going to be any American troops on the ground over there. Of course, he doesn't. I think he used the term boots on the ground. We know the CIA is operating over there and directing the airstrikes, so I guess the CIA agents aren't wearing boots. Maybe they're wearing sandals. So when President Obama says there's no boots on the ground, he's excluding the fact that there's some of the CIA operatives there in Libya directing the rebels. Maybe wearing boots, but go right ahead.
Well, there are also special forces units in there too, and have been since 2 weeks before the invasion.
Well, maybe they're wearing sandals.
Those are boots. Those are boots. He's just plain lying, Dr. Stan. There's no use a word about it. Well, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton expressed concern at a NATO meeting in Berlin over, now get this, she's calling it atrocities in Misrata, but gave no hint that Washington was prepared to re-engage in airstrikes. But there are two fibs uttered there by Clinton. One, that civilian casualties, which we call collateral damage when the U.S. does it, amounts to atrocities. Now that's talking about war crimes when you're talking atrocities. And that Washington is prepared to engage in airstrikes when they never stopped in the first place. Are we willing to subject ourselves to the same atrocity standard when we create civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan? I don't think so. Well, Clinton tried to put on a good face over Western resolve, but stories coming out of Europe clearly belie her claims of European unity over this attack. Several NATO members rebuffed calls from France and Britain to contribute more to the air attacks conducted under the United Nations mandate, supposedly to protect civilians. And U.S. officials said Allied commanders were not requesting greater resources. Now, there's another half-truth there. It is true that U.S. doesn't need other military resources, and the European leaders know this, but the U.S. is desperately calling for more NATO resources as a cover so that it appears that NATO is doing this and not the U.S.
And it is interesting. They say, well, now NATO is directing this, but, of course, America already dominates NATO. We'll be back here in just a moment with Joel Skousen. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Chris Joel is simply pointing out that they're trying to play out down the involvement of America and what's going on over there in Libya. America is controlling this whole thing. We may have turned suddenly the responsibility for leadership over to NATO, but we control NATO. We finance NATO. NATO is an extension of the American military, and it's the army of the one world government. So what is NATO doing over there? What does this have to do with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? It has everything to do with it. NATO is the world army, the world military, and it is carrying out the globalist goal, I believe, of course, first of all, toppling Libya, and then all of the countries over there in the Near East and the Middle East in preparation for their transfer to the control of the radical Islamic movement as we build step by step by step the best enemy money could buy. But you go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I think this desperate attempt to get NATO cover for the United States intentions there is that the government tends to feel that the U.S. people are really waking up and are getting a very strong anti-war syndrome. They're tired of paying for this, especially with all the budgetary problems that we have. Well, the U.S. knows all too well that the shaky facade of the Allied unity will only carry the show for so long. That is why it's essential to blow up the siege of Misrata into a massacre. Once the U.S. public is convinced something has to be done, then the U.S. will be able to renege on the pledge of no troops and move into an invasion of Libya. And that's the only way the U.S. is going to keep this from turning into a long-range military debacle, showcasing the EU impotence and the infighting that exists there in Europe. The role that Qatar plays in the false front NATO war with Libya tells us a lot about how desperate the U.S. is to hide our direction and involvement. The UK Guardian said that Qatar is secretly supplying French-provided anti-tank weapons to the Libyan rebels as part of its strategy of working to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. Officials in Doha, that's the capital of Qatar, confirmed that the Gulf states military had been shipping French-made Milan missiles to the rebel strongholds in Benghazi. Qatari government officials were tight-lipped about the deliveries, which were being organized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and probably made by sea. Britain's Foreign Secretary, William Hague, and other colleagues from the 21-nation Libya contact group, they always call their allies a contact group. Only a couple of those are making the decisions. The rest are there for political theater. They endorsed Qatar's position, and William Hague, British Foreign Secretary, insisted that the UK would supply only non-lethal equipment. Well, who are they kidding? These certainly aren't non-lethal. France's view is similar, but both countries, which are leading NATO airstrikes, accept that arming the rebels is legal.
Well, what really bothers me is the fact that our congressmen, none of them will speak out against it. The Republicans are solid behind the militarist action that's taking place, and even most of the Democrats don't have the courage to speak out. If they do, why we're not hearing about it. Why aren't our people there in Washington, D.C. saying, we don't want to be involved in another war? And this is exactly how we got involved in Vietnam. We were manipulated into Vietnam, and we're being manipulated into this totally unnecessary war.
Well, the silence from the Tea Party congressmen who got elected in this so-called watershed election are notably silent about this, and that's because of the traditional conservative view that war is a Republican conservative position, and that comes from the defending the Vietnam thing, which was a legitimate war against communist aggression. And that's why you didn't find any, ribbons about support our troops and other things during the Vietnam War. They wanted to poison the American people against war, and that's why I think that they gave us a no-win war and tied our hands. I remember when my fighter squadron came back from Vietnam, they told about not being able to arm their missiles unless a missile from an enemy plane was actually on its way towards them. Then they had to request by radio permission to arm. I mean, it's just suicidal. Well, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are the only Arab states to participate in this NATO-led military operations in Libya. Sheikh Hamad was in Washington. He's the leader of Qatar. He was in Washington on Thursday to talks with the Obama administration. They were expected to include Libyan situation. Well, you can bet a deal is made to provide Qatar with guarantees against a similar revolt happening there in return for Qatar's cooperation. And that point was brought home this week as the Obama administration turned on its former ally in the war on terror, Yemen, and called for the Saleh government to resign. Last month, Ali Abdullah Saleh was safely in a cozy relationship with the U.S., and now he's not. I mean, that's how quick the U.S. can turn on these so-called allies. Saleh was no less tyrannical than Gaddafi, but it's not for the sake of consistency that they're ousting him. It's part of a march of intervention across the entire continent of Africa that I talked about in last week's World Affairs Brief. Yemen expert Gregory Johnson noted, it is unfortunate that the Obama administration's policy only began to shift this past week. Saleh's demise has been self-evident for much longer than that, and in consistent U.S. refusals to see that, and the result of dithering calls for negotiation has only put the U.S. security interests more at risk. We see these are typical explanations from foreign policy experts that sit around Washington. They won't ever call a spade as I'm doing, that there's an actual ulterior motive here that explains why they allowed Gaddafi to stay in power for years and don't undermine him, and Saleh to stay in power for years. And then all of a sudden they overturn them, as if this is dithering, as if this is indecisiveness on the State Department, knowing and fretting about how bad he is, but needing him. I mean, this is just... But there are dozens of excuses like this stand for anything that the government wants to come up to cover for what is actually a conspiratorial plot to create conflict and install dictators and maintain them for many years. Well, for now, Qatar is safe, but it will, too, be betrayed in the future. Qatar is a tiny, wealthy country with large oil resources, but it has to play both sides of the fence to survive. It maintains good relationships with Iran and also hosts key military bases. How's that for consistency? I mean, if the U.S. were being consistent, they would demand as a condition of the military assistance, which they're pouring millions into Yemen, that they stop the relationships with Iran. But the U.S. isn't really interested in anything relatively to Iran except for exacerbating and making them a prime target, which is apparently put off for a while until the rest of the Middle East is stirred up. So while playing to the Arab world, Qatar also has secret liaisons with Israel and Hamas. How's that for playing both sides? Al Jazeera, the false front media organization for British MI6 satellite TV station, is not coincidentally based in Doha of Qatar. So obviously Qatar is really kind of a flagship base for U.S. and British intelligence.
And I think it's what point you're making is so very important. If you don't mind my reiterating it, but basically, Al Jazeera is the Islamic radical, we're told, television satellite that is broadcast to all of the Arab world over there, and supposedly the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood and the other extremists. It's actually always been a front for American and British intelligence, but we can't let the American people know that. We can't even let the Muslims understand that they're being manipulated into certainly joining this radical Islamic movement, I believe, in preparation for a great war we're going to have. And basically, it's those countries fall one at a time. And then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood takes over, and of course, this will be fostered by Al Jazeera. But they don't understand this is all being orchestrated by the intelligence agencies that have massive amounts of money. And once again, just as during the Second World War, when American corporations built up and financed Adolf Hitler, both before and during the war, so I fear the same thing is happening today. Would that be a fair appraisal?
Yeah, absolutely. A little more detail here is Al Jazeera was formed by the British Arabs, which the BBC had hired into the BBC Arab Bureau for doing Arab broadcasts, and that whole body defected to form Al Jazeera. And I suspect that basically they were hired in and tutored by the MI6, and their defection was in fact, well-financed means of starting, a propaganda regime for the Muslim people.
They were all employed, or almost all of them were employed by the BBC, and then of course something happened over there, and they shut down that until all of these people employed by the BBC suddenly all go to work for Al Jazeera.
Yeah, it's just
go right ahead.
Too good to be true that the whole BBC crew leaves, and well. So for now, Qatar is the go-between for the globalist forces attacking Libya. It hosts a Libyan rebel TV station and is marketing the Libyan crude that is under the control of the eastern oil field taken away from Gaddafi. Meanwhile, the so-called BRICS emerging powers, Brazil, acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all communist countries. The new communist bloc that supposedly doesn't exist anymore is what they're calling BRIC, or BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. And they're doing their best to express misgivings about NATO airstrikes after talks in China this week. Naturally, as the commies always do, when the U.S. is aggressing, but not when they do it, they urged an end to the so-called no-fly zone and the civil war.
And I think it's really so interesting that when they had the United Nations vote, why it was Russia and China and Germany that simply would not vote for it. And so I'm sure the Russians and the Chinese really, of course, want this whole thing to go ahead. I mean, this whole thing is planned, ladies and gentlemen. We're being led into this through the United Nations vote, and I'm sure the Russians and Chinese are working in very close concert with our leaders in preparation for this war that's coming. And a war is coming, a major war. It's going to devastate our economy. and kill millions more of our young people. We'll be back shortly. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, the BRIC nations, working through their leftist allies in the South, in the African Union, made a play for diplomatic solutions this week. Gaddafi accepted an African Union peace plan designed to get an immediate ceasefire. Now, the plan was presented to opposition leaders in Libya, whoever they are, and the plan was rejected, presumably because Gaddafi or his sons would have some future role in Libya. Well, the African Union is composed of an assortment of communists and former communists, if there is such a thing. South African President Jacob Zuma, ANC, communist terrorist, Mali's Amadou Touamani Touré, Mohamed Ould Abdel Aziz of Mauritania, Uganda foreign minister, who's, Uganda's famous, Idi Amin and others, and Denis Negroso of the Congo, all strong men, tyrannical powers, preaching that Gaddafi has got to, be undermined. The West, the rejected diplomatic attempts by the left contrasted strongly with a group of Middle Eastern and Western countries that, basically are tied to the globalists, who had a meeting in Qatar on Wednesday, all lackeys for the globalists. The so-called International Contact Group on Libya demanded that Gaddafi lead power and voice support for the rebels. Further evidence of our claims last week that there's a larger African destabilization plan going on. Israel made a preemptive strike on the Sudan this week, which we feel will be the next target after Libya. It's just right south of Libya. Jason Ditz, writing for antiwar.com, said, an unnamed senior military official in Israel has confirmed Wednesday that a Tuesday attack on Sudan was carried out by the Israeli military. The confirmation came after a no-comment response from the military itself in Israel. It's not our first time there, this official insisted. Now, that's an embarrassing admission for Israel, who, like the U.S., strictly denies any such black operation. And now this official, he's going to get canned for this, admits that they've been in there twice. And presumably, what he mentioned was a reference to the January 2009 Israeli attack, which likewise was not directly confirmed by the Olmert government, but was confirmed by U.S. officials. That airstrike was initially reported to have killed 39 people, but the Sudanese state media later put the toll of over 100. Many of those were civilians, but note there are no charge of atrocities made against Israel for killing civilians.
Well, now, why would Israel be attacking the Sudan? I'm not quite certain about that.
Well, the reason for the attack, likewise, has not been made public, and Sudanese media outlets claimed it was an Israeli attempt to keep Sudan from being taken off the list of terrorist-sponsor states. Other reports make vague mention of arms smuggling, which was also the excuse for the 2009 attack. We feel, at the World Affairs Brief, that it's being done to provoke a reaction in Sudan sufficient to pave the way for a U.S. NATO intervention after they wrap up in Libya. In other words, they're trying to stir the pot. They're trying to attack various places to get the Sudanese government to retaliate in some way that will justify an intervention. They may well be attempting to attack government forces to allow the rebels to get the message there that they should rise up and revolt against the Sudanese government.
Well, this is something I hadn't heard about, so I appreciate you bringing that out. Go right ahead.
Well, there's also a problem in the budgetary realm. Representative Brad Sherman, Democrat of California, no less, and a certified...
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Of course, our guest is Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, and certainly he's talking about the budget now. There's some problems with the budget. We've got a deficit of $1.65 trillion this year. They hammered out a courageous effort to rein in the budget. I think $38 billion out of a $1.65 trillion deficit. All the Republicans had a great victory. What, about 2% reduction in the massive deficit? Go right ahead.
Well, it's starting out with the problem with the war in Libya. As I'm saying, Brad Sherman said in his opening remarks at a House Foreign Relations Committee hearing that the White House is dramatically underestimating the cost of the nation's military involvement in Libya by relying on misleading accounting. That effort is costing us billions a week, he said. Well, both the White House and the Republicans are playing the game of who can tackle the budget deficit without really cutting anything. It's neither politically possible to raise taxes or cut entitlements, nor anything else, it seems. That didn't stop Obama for doing another grandstanding political speech this week on the budget. And although I'm no fan of GOP Budget Chairman Ryan's proposal, he did have the best rebuttal of Obama's budget sophistry. Here's an excerpt from this interview with Charlie Rose. He says, "You just attended the president's speech, Representative Ryan, on reducing the debt. Is that what you expected?" Ryan, "No, quite honestly, Charlie, it was pretty much the opposite of what I expected. He's now proposing, after just creating a fiscal commission, that he disavow that commission and didn't include it in his budget. He now proposed to create another commission to come up with ideas on how to fix the budget. He punted on this budget. Now he says he'll have to have another commission. And, oh, by the way, let's have this commission produce less deficit reduction, less savings than the prior commission produced." Charlie Rose then asked, "President Obama called your plan a vision that says if our roads are crumbling and our bridges collapse, we can't afford to fix them. But we can somehow afford more than $1 trillion in new tax breaks for the wealthy. How do you respond?" So here's Ryan. Well, first of all, we're not talking about cutting taxes. We're talking about keeping tax revenues where they are by making the Bush tax cut permanent and cleaning up all the junk in the tax code for a flatter, fairer, and simpler tax. So we're not talking about cutting taxes. We do want to keep the tax revenues where they are, and I would be against that, Dan, as you would, and fix the tax code. And with respect to all the spending, you know, that partisan spending rhetoric, if you don't fix entitlements, if you don't get spending under control, there's not going to be any money left for those other things like roads and bridges, whether Obama does it or we do it as the GOP. So I'm amazed, he says, that he would use that kind of hyperbolic, hyperventilating rhetoric to describe our plan. Charlie Rose, the president says he can save money over the next 10 years by reducing the cost of health care, and that's more important than creating a voucher program. Ryan says, "I actually believe he knows that this is not a voucher program. His experts know that this is a premium support program. Vouchers give the money to the person. They go out in the marketplace. That's not what this is. People get a choice. There's a difference of opinion here, and this is where he did show us he had some knowledge of the facts because he said that health care costs are rising too fast. The president just said he wants this unelected bureaucracy with no oversight to control from Congress to indiscriminately cut Medicare reimbursements, Medicare, meaning price controls from government, and that doesn't work." Well, this is the most disturbing thing that comes up, Stan. Charlie Rose asked him, "Do you and the president differ on the social compact between this country and its citizens?" Well, now that's an implied concept, as if it's a fact. You know, Charlie Rose is saying, do you differ on this social compact between this country? What this is a euphemism for redistribution of wealth, as if it is, by being a part of society, we the taxpayers have an obligation to accept forced redistribution for the social good of society. That's what he means if you accept the social compact. And guess what Ryan says? I would say yes. That means he agrees with it. Incredibly, when a Republican can campaign about limited government and the Constitution and then endorse social welfare schemes, we're in real trouble, Stan.
Well, nobody wants to admit that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. Certainly, Medicare is a Ponzi scheme. The only solution would be a voucher system of some sort, and certainly give the people who can afford to get their own health care some help in purchasing it. As we down the line, we have to move to do away with these things, but at least as an interim measure, there's nothing wrong with the voucher scheme. And for the people who can't afford it, why, of course, they're going to have to simply be part of the Kevorkian health care plan, and they're going to die. What we really need to do is change this whole responsibility to the local government. And, of course, let the decisions be made there, but not by a nameless bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. And the only solution is to withhold health care from the elderly and kill them off. And they're not entitled to health care in a free society, only in a controlled society when somebody determines who lives and who dies. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, Joel, you go right ahead, but none of the politicians want to take this on. I remember when I ran for Congress on 2 occasions, I was always told, never talk about Social Security and Medicare. Maybe you don't agree with them, but it's a kiss of death if you ever, of course, come out and criticize them. And I think we need people who have the courage to criticize them and saying they don't work. And I said, we've got to do away with them. The federal government is bankrupt, and this is going to destroy our nation. It's going to destroy our currency. It's going to impoverish our entire people. And that's why countries throughout the world are simply getting away from treasury bonds. We're actually buying up all of our own bonds. We're monetizing our debt, and this is the road to the destruction of our economy, of our monetary system, and certainly the impoverishment of our people. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I like what Lew Rockwell said. He put it into stark perspective. In the first place, no one's talking about actual cuts, not even the supposed radical Republican budget. These are cuts in projected spending, meaning that everyone is dealing with symbolic changes in a future that is just as symbolic. Even on paper, the only way to consider these cuts is to compare them with the GDP and the national debt, both of which are slated to rise. Forgetting those 2 metrics and looking at the actual numbers, there's no cuts at all and only increases. Well, even the dating of the Republicans' balanced budget is ridiculous. So the budget will be fully balanced by 2040, he says. That's 3 decades from now. Few of the people will be in office, will still be there, and many will be dead. See how viable this is. Consider how many political plans of the year 1982 still survive today, and who even remembers what they created in a budget in 1982. That's what we're dealing with. The Republican plan proposes domestic cuts in these gargantuan programs like Social Security and Medicare, with nothing specific beyond the old prattle about establishing bipartisan commissions and sending block grants to the states. There is nothing specific here beyond a numbers-laden pipe dream. No programs are abolished, no benefits are slashed, or even trimmed. And although the propagandists claim to attack the culture of spending in Washington, there's not one word about taking on the money-printing machine that made the $14 trillion national debt possible in the first place. And when you try to cut back the powers of the Fed, as Ron Paul does, everybody abandons him. Remember that time when there were 300 co-signers for his audit the Fed thing?
Sure.
And they all abandoned him when it came down to trying to put teeth into it. They were signing on.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. He's pointing out that neither the leaders of the Republican or the Democrat Party really want to cut and do away with these Ponzi schemes, which is what Medicare and Social Security are. What's the alternative? The destruction of our monetary system, the destruction of our society. And you destroy the monetary system, you destroy the society, and neither the leaders of the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party have the courage to stand up and say, we are not entitled to anything. In a free society, you are not entitled to anything. Yes, we need to have some sort of a system for helping people who can't afford medical care, but it's got to be done locally. Get government out of it. Stop the federal government from taking all the money back to Washington, D.C. and wasting it. Leave the money at the local level and let us try to come up with a system to provide health care for those who would otherwise die without it, and to provide some form of a welfare system for the people who would otherwise starve. But we can never allow this to be done at the state or the national level, because, of course, the fallacy of everything is people will always vote for the politician who promises them the most. And this is why the people who created America wanted to limit the power of the federal government. They didn't want a democracy because they knew people would always vote themselves into tyranny. And of course, as Thomas Jefferson said so well, in matters of politics, speak not to me of confidence in men, but bind them down for mischief with the chains of the Constitution. Well, they've taken the chains off of the politicians, they're forcing them for the people, and now they're about to destroy our society. And where is the leadership other than Ron Paul and Rand Paul? There's not very much of it there. I guess, of course, is Joel Skousen. Joel, before we go on, I want to tell our listeners how they can subscribe to World Affairs Brief and get a copy, and then tell them about the books you've written that we do carry on the secure home and a strategic relocation. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Stan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. People can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. There are also references to my books on the website, or they can go directly to www.joelskousen.com. That's Skousen, where I have 3 major books, 1 booklet on preparedness list, also a Constitution CD on why I believe the Constitution is essentially dead and how to fix it. But the 3 books that Radio Liberty carries are particularly hot items right now, especially the new 3rd edition of Strategic Relocation. It's been 9 months in the preparation process, and ever since we got our first printed copies 2 months ago, we literally have gone through all the first printing and have just reprinted again. It's just overwhelmed everyone, and so Radio Liberty has them in stock. So if you're looking for this great book on how to develop contingency plans and find safe places to relocate to and avoid the threats of this world, that's the book to get. My major work is The Secure Home, 700 pages, as big as a phone book, everything from high-security construction, retreats, self-sufficiency, solar, water power generators, safe rooms, and how to construct them, all the architectural details. It's really a goldmine of information. And the last book I have is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. This is a specific architectural plan book on how to do a safe room in an existing basement. This is not new construction, but remodeling. And the cheapest way, basically, to get a high-security room in a house is to follow those plans. So all 3 of those books are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Well, Joel, go right ahead. We were discussing, certainly, the tragic situation that neither the Republican leadership nor the Democrat leadership will address the real problem, and that is the fact that our monetary system is falling apart, that other countries throughout the world are turning against the dollar. Certainly, Joseph Stiglitz, professor at Columbia University, professor of economics, said we're going to have a new world reserve currency. George Soros has said the same thing. The IMF has said this. This means that the dollar, which of course has been the dominant currency in the world going back to Bretton Woods, I think 1944, 1945, is about to be replaced and will be replaced, I think, within the next year or two. And when that happens, it will have a profound impact on everybody listening to this program. I believe there's going to be marked inflation. We call it hyperinflation. But when you're dealing with 20 or 30% inflation, why, of course, that can have a devastating effect of destroying your life savings, everything that you put aside for your retirement or for you securing your prosperity. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, as you might have known from last week's World Affairs Brief, I am in disagreement that you can make a change to a world currency. It's true that they're talking about it, but I think they're prepping for something that can't possibly come about unless there's a major war to give it justification. The fact is, the realities of a world currency is you have to have a world financial order. You have to have an agreement like you have in the EU where all the countries agree to a certain rate of inflation. You know darn well that the Fed is never going to agree to, like the European countries did, a 3.5% rate of inflation per year. They're inflating the currency, much higher than that, and so they're not going to agree to that, and there'll be cheating. There's no enforcement mechanism. So you see, you can't have a world currency unless you have a world government. But I think what we're hearing now is all of the preparations, and it may take years for them, but it really won't happen until a war comes when they have an excuse. Because you see, if you just said we're going to have a new currency, you'd end up having to print $200 trillion, and then trade in all your dollars for it, and you'd have another currency that's a fiat currency, and what good is that? The only change would be as if that there was some world commission that would determine who could do it. And the Fed isn't going to give up those rights to control that. We know that. So do we think that the rest of the world is going to front for the Fed and say, yeah, it's a world currency, but you will really decide what the value is and you will have the same rights to print? I don't think so. So they're talking about it, but as I say, I think it's preliminary. I think it's going to take years. It's not like the Bretton Woods where you actually had a viable currency because it was gold redeemable. I don't mean gold backed, which means there's gold in the central bank. Unless it's redeemable, it's not gold backed for the purchaser or the holder of the dollar. They're not going to do a gold backed currency because that prohibits governments from inflating. So I see no way that they can do this. I mean, even if they were to hyperinflate the dollar, which I don't think you're capable of, even at $10 trillion a year, that's only 1% of the money supply in dollars. But even if you could get 20 or 30% inflation, it's not simply easy to say, well, let's have a new currency if it's just going to be a fiat currency like the dollar is today and if it's controlled by the same Fed. So I don't see how they can do this and how they can actually get it done without a war, which would turn everything upside down and give them the advantage of being able to repudiate the debt in one fell swoop, especially if America's attacked, as I'm predicting. Well, of course, the real legislative battle is over current year spending, and where the Republicans appear to be slightly less profligate due to pressure from the Tea Party types. The government might shut down unless the agreement is reached, and I hope it happens, says Lew Rockwell. It doesn't, of course, mean the end of government as we know it. It can just provide a few days of entertainment. The Republicans are at least correct on this point. The government's finances are in a state of total calamity, thanks to them and the Democrats. With each shift in the business cycle, we keep going through the same stages, only gets worse each time. It will continue to do so. During the boom, the tax revenues soar, and the President and Congress initiate vast new spending programs. Then the recession hits and tax revenues plummet, driving up the deficit. But rather than cut back on spending, economists instruct Congress to do what they want to do anyway, spend even more to supposedly jumpstart the economy. And so it goes as we go downward spiral into the pit. Now, there is a bottom to this. When you can't pay the interest on the debt, which will happen sometime in 2020 or 22, then you've got a real crisis, and that's why I think the war will come before then. The only reason this nonsense is sustainable is due to the promise of the Federal Reserve to back all this spending with money creation. The Fed is what makes the whole racket too big to fail. This is why budget battles end up being insignificant to the future of government spending patterns. It's just all political theater. Now, what's interesting is that it turns out the Republicans and the Democrats were both lying to us that the real budget cut numbers is far less than $38 billion. The truth is that the great budget crisis, which supposedly took us on the verge of a government shutdown, was just a whole bunch of political theater. Even the Associated Press is declaring that our politicians used accounting sleight of hand to reach the $38.5 billion budget cut figure. Not that $38 billion is even impressive to begin with. That would be just 1% of the federal budget. But once you strip away the accounting charades, the real budget cut number is somewhere around $14 billion, Stan. Turns out the budget cut includes money left unspent from previous years, earmarks that were going nowhere anyway, unused census money, programs that Obama had already planned to cut. The more you examine the budget here, the more it becomes obvious that Republicans and Democrats had no intention of doing anything serious about the debt. The U.S. government is still going to run a record-setting deficit in 2011, and both Republicans and Democrats are to blame.
And it's all political stage, it's all political theater, it's all political posturing, and the American people got taken in again. Go right ahead.
Well, the big stick that Obama wields in this battle is the power to shut down the entire government and cause great pain and anguish among the public, something that's not necessary even when the money supposedly runs out. To stop this charade, which is used to pressure the Republicans to do another stopgap funding measure, Senator Rand Paul created a bill called Shutdown Prevention Act of 2011. Congress may have just reached a deal to cut a laughable $38 billion, said Rand Paul, while we still run up nearly $2 trillion in new debt this year. But at least Rand has a thoughtful proposal to stop this madness and permanently cut unsustainable spending. He says no shutdown is necessary at all, just agonizing pain for the acolytes of big government. In essence, Paul's bill would require the government to still provide minimum essential services and keep offices open, but cut all discretionary spending. This takes away the club of threats the president uses against the public. Well, it's the same thing at counties. If you don't give them enough tax revenue, what do? They shut down police and fire instead of the welfare system or the other bureaucrats. They cut out the things that scare people to death. Well, Thomas Sowell this week did see room to cut money to the many billionaires and inside corporations that are on the receiving end of billions of subsidies. The Liberals' easy solution, of course, is just to increase taxes on the rich, but if you do the math, there aren't enough rich to cover the huge record-breaking deficit. My plan, he said, would start by cutting all government transfer payments to billionaires. Many, if not most, people are probably unaware that the government is handing out the taxpayers' money to billionaires. But agricultural subsidies go to a number of billionaires. Very little goes to the ordinary farmer. Big corporations also get big bucks from the government, not only in agricultural subsidies, but in the name of green policies or in the name of alternative energy, just huge subsidies. And in the name of whatever else will rationalize shoveling the taxpayers' money out the door to whomever the administration designates for its own political reasons, and that's what lures people, frankly, into becoming insider-connected corporations, is the promise of big money and handouts from government. The usual political counterattacks against spending cuts will not work against this new kind of spending approach. How many heart-rending stories can the media run about billionaires who have lost their handouts from the taxpayers? How many tears will be shed if General Motors gets dumped off the gravy train? Well, of course, they won't do that. They will show the tears of the poor union makers or union people who are losing their jobs. It would also, says Sowell, be eye-opening for many people to discover how much government money is going into subsidizing all sorts of things that have nothing to do with helping the poor or protecting the public. This would include government-subsidized insurance for posh and pricey coastal resorts that are located too dangerously close to the ocean for private insurance. We have no business subsidizing insurance in flood-prone areas, but the federal government is the only guarantor of that kind of insurance. And it's got perverse incentives, as you know, Stan, because it encourages people to live in dangerous areas, flooding, and still get insurance. This approach would not only circumvent the sob stories, if you target these billionaire fat cat insider corporations, but it would also circumvent the ideological battles over whether to cut off money to Planned Parenthood or National Public Radio. The money to be saved by cutting off agricultural subsidies to the wealthy and the big corporations is vastly greater than the money to be saved by cutting off Planned Parenthood or the National Public Radio, much as they both deserve to be cut off, he said, and I agree with that. Instead of attacking these programs as a whole, what is far more valuable is the compulsory aspect of these programs. If Medicare is so great, asked Sowell, why is it necessary for the government to force people to be covered by Medicare as a precondition for receiving Social Security? Many people with private health insurance would rather continue to rely on that instead of being trapped in Medicare red tape. It is not a question of taking away Medicare, but allowing people to opt out, saving the taxpayer from having to just subsidize something that many people don't want. Not a question of forcing people off Social Security, but private retirement accounts can offer a better deal. So what he's suggesting is we have competition, we allow people to opt out, and that's the quickest way to find out if any government program is really working. Opt out. If you didn't, for example, force people to pay taxes to public schools, whether you use them or not, and you gave the right for people to opt out and take their money with them, public schools will wither on the vine and have to become competitive, like private schools who educate students at a fraction of the cost of public schools.
And do a far better job, that's for certain.
That's right. Well, in another story, just very egregious, I have contacts both in the Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is called ICE. They are always telling me that the Washington offices of their respective agencies are always trying new ways to stop enforcement of the law. Officers on the ground know that there's a secret policy agenda to aid and abet illegal immigration.
In other words, basically, all this talk about, we're going to stop illegal immigration, basically it's just exactly the opposite. They want illegal immigration. They want a multicultural, multiracial society made of people who come here illegally. Go right ahead.
And who will vote for liberal social welfare programs.
Amen to that. And of course, this is all being funded by the Ford Foundation and the other great tax-exempt foundations. They're actually funding organizations like La Raza and Maldive and LULAC. The Ford Foundation, using tax-exempt money, is funding organizations for illegal immigrants to the United States. Why? Because Henry Ford and the people he represented always wanted to destroy America, but because the average American has never been told these things, they don't understand who Henry Ford was and what energized him, or the Brotherhood of Darkness, which, of course, he was intimately involved with. We'll be back here in just a moment to wrap up today's program, but you need to get the information that Joel has to offer. Well, Joel, we've got 3 minutes for you to wrap up the program.
Well, thanks, Dan. It was no surprise to me when Fox News reported that Co-Chief County Sheriff Larry Deaver said that a Border Patrol supervisor and others recently alerted him that the federal agency's office in Arizona's southern border was under orders to keep apprehension numbers down during specific reporting periods. Those orders included at times an all-out halt to arrest illegal aliens trying to cross the border. The senior supervisor agent is telling me about how their mission is now to scare people back into Mexico. Deaver said, I had to go back to my guys and tell them not to catch anybody and that their job is to chase people away. They are not to catch anybody, arrest anyone. Their job was to set up a posture to intimidate people and to get them to go back across the border. And it's no surprise to me as well, Stan, that the reaction of the U.S. Chief of Border Patrol is one of total denial. Chief Michael Fisher said, that assertion is completely 100% false. Even that was a quote from Michael Fisher, head of the Border Patrol. Well, he's just plain lying. Even Democratic sheriffs who are yes-men to the feds aren't buying that. Sheriffs in other Arizona counties along the border said they have not heard of any such orders, but 2 of them, both Democrats who generally support Obama administration efforts on the borders, said they know Deaver well and believe he would never knowingly say something like that if it weren't true. That is absolutely true. We know who's lying, and it's the head of the... Because, I mean, I have these contacts in ICE and others, even major supervisors, they're always getting pressure not to prosecute, not to look, not to investigate, to keep things down. It's really a tragedy. We have virtual lawbreakers at the Washington level.
Well, it is tragic, but there is an agenda, and that, of course, is a multicultural, multilingual nation, simply one of the nations in this new one-world society that these people are planning, and, of course, the destruction of the very foundation of the moral fabric of our society. They're doing a pretty good job of it.
That's right. Well, your listeners should get a copy of the World Affairs Brief coming out tomorrow. I'm going to cover why Glenn Beck had a falling out with Fox. That should be an interesting topic to talk about.
All right, fine. Well, we'll look forward then. We'll talk to you early in the morning. Thanks very much for being with us. It's always a pleasure. I'm glad you're back safe and sound.
Thank you, Stan. Good to be with you.
Yeah, we missed you last week. Anyway, God bless. Thanks so much. That, of course, was Joel Skousen, and he'll be with us on our early morning program tomorrow. If you have an opportunity, we hope you'll tune in to our American Freedom Network program at 7 o'clock Pacific time. Well, this is Dr. Stan. We do hope you, of course, enjoyed Joel Skousen's program. If you'd like to get his books, Strategic Relocation, The Safe Home, and How to Prepare a Safe Room in Your Home, all 3 books are available by calling 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. The major question is, why is it, of course, that neither political party will take a stand to try to correct the financial problems we're having? Before we get into really the destruction of our monetary system and the destruction of the life savings of our people. And basically already this year we've had probably a 10% inflation. Who knows what it's going to be by the end of this year? Price of oil is going up. Price of imports are going up. Price of food is going up, and it'll be even worse next year. Well, you can't understand anything unless you understand the brotherhood of darkness and the spiritual forces at work. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to get Ted Flynn's book, The Hope of the Wicked, The Hope of the Wicked. And then, of course, you need to get my talk on the Forbidden Secret, my talk on the Dark Secret, and the syllabuses, both of them. If you want to understand smart meters, if you want to understand why they're intentionally running up the price of oil and trying to get us out of our cars, you need to get my talk on sustainable development, the road to world government. There's a syllabus, a 4-tape set to go with that. You need to get the information. We do have Agenda 21 available through Radio Liberty, published by the United Nations. We want you to read it. You can get the Santa Cruz version. Actually, the original Agenda 21 was actually planned here in Santa Cruz, and they talk quite openly about wanting to get us out of our cars and out of our homes and lower our standard of living. When you understand that, you can understand why they want to suddenly destroy the value of our currency. Do you know a better way to lower the standard of living of the American people than to impoverish them? And that's what it's all about. It's all laid out in the Earth Charter. Equitable distribution of wealth among nations. In other words, transfer our factories, transfer our wealth, transfer our production, transfer our jobs to other countries. And of course, this is why they're intentionally have given our major corporations a tax break. You don't have to pay any taxes if you go overseas. Stay here in America, you pay a 35% tax. Go overseas where you can get cheap labor. Why? Of course, you don't have to pay any taxes. Now, is it any wonder that we've transferred 8.5 million American jobs and many of our major corporations overseas? Part of a well-laid-out plan. They just don't want the American people to know what's going on. That's why you need to listen to our programs, get our material. You can listen to our programs 5 hours a day, or actually 9 hours a day on the Internet at radioliberty.com. That's radioliberty.com. We do a program from 8 to 9 every morning on the American Freedom Network, 4 hours every day on Genesis, and then our own network in the evening, and you can get that at radioliberty.com on the Internet. You can listen to it on MP3, on iPod. If you have just a regular cell phone with unlimited minutes, you can tune in to our afternoon program on Genesis and listen to it any time of the day or the night. Get others to listen. Get them informed. A lot of people are going to think you're crazy when you talk about these things, but your job is to tell them what's going on. It's the Lord's job to make them hear, and if they're supposed to hear, they're going to hear. We also suggest you go to our website. There is there on the home page, there's a banner, what it says, the story of Jesus. We want you to go there and listen to the story of Jesus. It's the greatest story ever told, and you can listen to it, you can read it, and it's suddenly based entirely on the 4 major Gospels, and hopefully after you've actually gone over the major story, the greatest story ever told, why you, of course, want to go to the Scriptures. Our job is to try to get people to return to our Lord. If we do not have a major revival in America, we're going to lose this country. Please pray for America, but pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and our protection.